Hello, and welcome to Eddy Mumma, Compelled to Create at the Gadsden Arts Center and Museum, an online conversation. My name is Anne Gilroy. I am the art curator of the galleries at the historic Thomas Center in Gainesville, Florida, and I wrote the book Mr. Eddy Lives, The Art and Life of Eddy Mumma. The story of Eddy Mumma begins in 1969, when a 61-year-old man with no previous experience in making art decided he wanted to learn to paint. He signed up for lessons at a nearby senior center, but lasted only one day with formal instruction. Mumma made no claim, divine or otherwise, to what inspired him to start painting. He learned as he went, working in near isolation for 16 years. He painted obsessively from 1969 until his death in 1985. Mumma left behind no diary, no notes, no insight about his process. Although his paintings are proudly signed, they are not dated. The information we have about him and about his work comes from first-person interviews with his family and a few acquaintances, and from the examination of his art. The vast majority of the work Mumma made shows a single solitary figure with large prominent eyes and greatly exaggerated hands and fingers. The figure is often elaborately costumed and almost always includes a hat, headpiece, or halo. Sometimes the figure appears to be female, with the same characteristics of eyes, hands, and hat. Most often the iconic figure seems to be male or ambiguous in gender. Eddy Mumma was in poor health when he took up painting. He suffered from diabetes and was beset by a neurological condition of unknown diagnosis. His eyesight was poor, compromised by cataracts. He lost first one leg, then the other to amputations due to complications from his diabetes. He was confined to a wheelchair in his small house in Gainesville. But once Mumma took up painting, he didn't stop. The walls of his house were soon covered with his art. He painted the doors, the appliances, and, as we see here, the lampshades in his house. He painted every available surface, including what others would consider the backside of canvas boards or mat board. Here we see two sides of one work of art, with a wire for hanging visible on the image on the left. Mumma's son-in-law and grandson brought him art supplies, food, and the medication he needed. This is a photograph of the installation of his work at the galleries at the historic Thomas Center in Gainesville. Hundreds of pieces began to accumulate in his little house, but he made no effort to show or sell his work. Here we see his work installed at the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. According to his grandson, who visited with supplies, he worked obsessively each day. At Eddy Mumma's death in 1985, there were over 1,000 pieces of work in his house. Others were crated and stored in a shed, many of them ruined by bugs and weather. The number of images he made was even larger, as he often painted over his work or painted on both sides of many of the pieces. But of course, it's not the number of pieces he produced that mark him as a great self-taught artist. It's his powerful compositions, his astonishing use of color, and the accomplishment of an extraordinary and singular vision. That's what earns Mumma his place in art history. Today, Eddy Mumma is recognized as an important American self-taught artist, also sometimes termed an outsider artist, a visionary artist, or a folk artist. So in our lifetime, and in fact in very recent years, this artist went from being unknown to being discovered, recognized as important, collected, and accessioned into some of the premier art institutions in our country. So, how did hundreds and hundreds of pieces of Eddy Mumma's work, made in isolation in the 1970s and 1980s, go from this tiny house in Gainesville to the permanent collections of these prestigious museums, including the Smithsonian, the American Folk Art Museum, the American Visionary Art Museum, and the Art Museum of Milwaukee, to being the featured art at the 2015 Smithsonian American Art Museum Gala, celebrating the renovation and reopening of the museum's self-taught and folk art galleries. Although Eddy Mumma painted in Florida, he was born in Ohio, in a small house in West Milton, near Dayton, Ohio, in 1908. Mumma is seen here as a boy in the lower right corner, the fifth son in his family, and part of the fifth generation of Mummas born in the United States. The family ancestor had arrived from Germany in 1748, part of a wave of immigrants from Germany to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Young Eddy was said to be the favorite son in the family, spoiled by his older brothers, and very close to his mother, Eddy. In 1908, the year of Eddy's birth, one of the most powerful women in America was Mary Baker Eddy, the controversial founder of the First Church of Christ Scientist. Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science movement rejected materialism and granted opportunity and status specifically to women. Eddy's mother, Eddy, was a convert from Protestant faith of her childhood to Christian Science. In that devotion to Christian Science and its controversial founder, Eddy Mumma named her youngest son Eddy, not Edward or Edmund, after Mary Baker Eddy. She raised her son in the Christian Science religion, living by the key tenets, including the belief that a strong faith is a more powerful agent of healing than conventional medicine. Sometime in the early 1930s, Eddy made a radical decision to leave her husband. The census record indicates she was living with two other women, likely also members of the Christian Science faith, in Cleveland, Ohio. Eddy dropped out of school, disappeared from Cleveland. Family legend tells that he spent some years riding the rails, doing odd jobs wherever he found himself. Eddy and his mother reunited in 1935 and moved together from Cleveland to Springfield, Ohio. In 1935 in Springfield, Eddy met Thelma Huebner, the young woman who would become his wife. She was a member of the Christian Science faith. She was smart, educated, and the daughter of an affluent Springfield family. Eddy and Thelma marry. They devote themselves to their family and to their Christian Science community. Eddy takes a job with his father-in-law as a salesman. An inheritance from the family at the death of Thelma's father allows him to buy property, and Thelma and Eddy establish a farm. In 1938, they have one daughter, Carol. The 1940s are glory days for Eddy and Thelma. They work together, they prosper on the farm, they build two houses on the farm property, one for their family and one for Thelma's mother, Stella. They successfully raise cattle and crops, add a fishery to the farm, they collect antiques, they take both their mothers, Eddy and Stella, to Bermuda, and they love to see opera performances. But in 1956, tragedy strikes. Thelma dies of untreated breast cancer at age 44, the very week of Carol's high school graduation. Carol leaves the farm for college some months later. Eddy and his mother-in-law Stella are bereft at the loss of Thelma and saddened by Carol's leaving for college. In their confusion and grief, they choose to marry. Carol is shocked and upset at the decision. She makes fewer and fewer trips home from college, and upon graduation, estranges herself completely from her father and grandmother, seen here with her. She marries Paul Gonzalez, and together they leave Ohio for a new life in Daytona Beach, Florida. The The 1960s were dark years for Eddy Mumma. He was in poor health, drinking for the first time in his life, suffering a crisis of faith, estranged from his daughter. He was hospitalized for a period of time, whether for alcohol abuse or seizure disorder is unclear. His marriage was characterized by discord, and Stella was beginning to show signs of dementia, sometimes found wandering the town streets and returned home by police who knew the family. They sometimes found Eddy passed out from drinking. In 1967, the remaining family members in Ohio reached out to Eddy's estranged daughter, Carol, who had headed out for Daytona, but was living and working in Gainesville, Florida, with her husband and 2 young children. Although Carol wanted no relationship with her father and grandmother, she felt the responsibility of the family. The farm was sold, and Eddy and Stella were moved to Gainesville. Stella became a resident at a care facility, and Eddy lived in one of 3 small houses the family bought with the proceeds of the sale of the farm. By 1969, Eddy was living in his little house in Gainesville, and his son-in-law was looking out for him. His daughter Carol did not have a personal relationship with her father, but through her husband she saw to his care. Although Eddy no longer used alcohol, his health was a continuing challenge. Then, in 1969, an article about Gainesville woodcarver Jesse Aaron appeared in the Christian Science Monitor. The article remarked on the fact that Aaron had not started carving until age 80. Although Eddy had broken with his faith, he was a lifelong subscriber to the Monitor, and there's little doubt he would have read that article. We'll never know if Eddy was inspired by reading about Jesse Aaron, but in 1969, the same year the article appears, Eddy Mumma signed up for art classes at a senior center. He was 61 years old. He lasted 1 day in the class. Back in his little house, though, Eddy begins his self-taught art journey. Here we have one of his earliest paintings, as recollected by his grandson. Notice his name, Ed, in the upper left corner. The marks that he's making on the canvas aren't strong. The composition is weak. The colors are muddy. He's just beginning on his long process. Here's another early piece, possibly copied from source material. Here his name has appeared in the upper right along the edge. Here's another early piece. He's finding his way into the composition. His brush strokes are not yet masterful. These early works show his learning curve. He's not yet achieved mastery of the paint or found his character that he would spend so many years painting. At the time, there was a very popular series of how-to books, how to paint, how to draw animals, etc. Eddy's grandson remembers buying those books, $1 each, and he and his father would deliver them to his grandfather along with food, medicine, and art supplies. Some of Eddy's early paintings appear to use these books as reference material. The illustration on the left comes from How to Paint the Figure, one book in the series. Eddy was using source material of all kinds as he learned to paint. His daughter Carol had a subscription to National Geographic, and we know from the family that the copies of the magazine ended up at Eddy Mumma's house. An unusual early portrait by Eddy appears to be a copy of a portrait his mother had made of her own father. The portrait was in Eddy's childhood home and belonged to his daughter Carol, so he had seen it his entire life. Eddy also copies masterworks interpretively. Here we have an Anthony Van Dyck painting. Here we have a copy of Blue Boy by Sir Thomas Gainsborough. In 1978, Eddy's cousin, Betty Thompson, stops to visit on an annual trip to Florida. She takes photographs that are the only surviving photos of the inside of Eddy Mumma's house. In this 1978 photograph, we can see that Eddy is not in good health. We can also see the early work on the walls of his house. There are only 3 photographs, but in them we can see numbers of the paintings that still survive. A close look at the photographs shows animals, still life paintings, landscapes, copies of the great masters, but also the beginnings of the figure that Eddy will come to focus on in the later years of his work. By basing a broad timeline on the photographs by his cousin Betty, we can start to date the photographs pre-1978 and post-1978. Here we can see that his work gets much stronger after 1978. You can see the figure on the right compared to the earlier copy of Sir Thomas Gainsborough, Blue Boy, on the left. In this still life, you can see that his composition and brush strokes really strengthen. Eddy still uses source material as idea reference, but his work and his vision really grow stronger. His signature becomes part of the art, as you can see on the right side of this copy of the image by John James Audubon. And at this time there is evidence of the emergence of his own vision, and that character, the singular characteristics of the hands and eyes, begins to appear. Eddy's copy work becomes more interpretive, and the originality of his work strengthens. The How to Paint series of books had a title called How to Paint Works by the Great Masters. Eddy Mumma is applying his own vision to works by Van Gogh and by Leonardo da Vinci. In this particular painting, notice how his signature has replaced the trees in the background behind the figure. It's an amazing graphic element. Eddy begins to move from copy work to developing the identity of the character that he will paint almost exclusively from this point forward. Eddy's canvas or board sizes get larger, his brush strokes are bolder, and his singular vision really begins to take shape. Eddy's compositions become strong. The signature is an important element in each piece of work. Meanwhile, the man who is credited with discovering Eddy Mumma, Lenny Kessel, is teaching art at Santa Fe College in Gainesville. Kessel hears about Mumma from a student of his, a tenant in one of Eddy Mumma's small houses. Kessel is intrigued at the idea of the landlord and really wants to meet him. He wants to see the art inside. He knocks on Eddy Mumma's door time and time again, and eventually is able to enter the house. Eddy Mumma and Lenny Kessel become good friends, and in fact Lenny Kessel likely is the person who bestowed the name Mr. Eddy on Eddy Mumma. Kessel himself was a prolific artist and the consummate art teacher, empowering, supporting, applauding, and encouraging generations of artists in Gainesville. Here he is with Jesse Aaron, sometime between 1965 and 1975. Lenny Kessel encouraged Mumma. His wife tells us that Lenny showed Eddy the work of artists, such as Van Gogh, Manet, Modigliani, Gauguin, and Velázquez, saying to Mumma, "These are your brothers." Kessel was also an art collector and a very shrewd one. He begins to trade Mumma for art supplies, and a slow trickle of Eddy's work goes from inside that small house to Lenny Kessel. Over time, Kessel amasses a small collection of Eddy's work, variously reported as being from 60 to several hundred pieces. This is the first time that Eddy Mumma's work has really moved from his house out into the world. Kessel shows the work of Eddy Mumma to his young friend Josh Feldstein, who had an avid interest in what was popularly called folk art. Josh Feldstein falls in love with the work of Eddy Mumma. Feldstein acquires one piece of Eddy Mumma's work from Lenny Kessel, but he wants more. Feldstein tries hard to meet Eddy Mumma. He knocks on the door, he tries to visit, no luck. In April of 1986, Josh and his wife Judy write a letter to Mr. Eddy. Josh leaves it on Mumma's porch, wedged in the screen door to his house. Josh is asking to meet Eddy to maybe buy some of his work. He goes by daily, but the letter stays between the screen door and the door of the house. Months later, in October of 1986, Eddy Mumma passes away at the age of 78. His son-in-law found him the next morning on the couch in the living room next to his easel. In a remarkable coincidence, Josh biked by Eddy Mumma's house, once again hoping to see him on the very day that he had passed away. Josh sees the family members on the porch. He sees cars he doesn't recognize, and he sees a dumpster in the driveway. Eddy Mumma's daughter Carol is cleaning out the house and is about to throw away all of the artwork. In a moment of absolutely decisive action, Feldstein offers to buy it all and saves over 800 pieces of art from being thrown away. Carol selects a few pieces for the family to keep. Josh and a friend go back into the house and pry work from the walls and box up work from the floor. Josh and Judy Feldstein take custody of hundreds of pieces of art that's insect-encrusted, moldy, dirty, smelly. Josh spends years cleaning and preserving it. In 2015, I was privileged to work on the collection, research Eddy Mumma, and curate the first solo exhibition of Mumma's work. In a nod to the door that kept Eddy separated from the world, we installed a vintage screen door and windows in the gallery at the historic Thomas Center. Following the exhibition at the galleries at the historic Thomas Center in Gainesville, the work of Eddy Mumma went to the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore that year. Interest in Eddy Mumma's work mushroomed in the folk art world. From the exhibition at the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore, the work began to be accessioned by those institutions we looked at earlier in the talk. And now, the Gadsden Arts Center and Museum is hosting the third solo exhibit of the work of Eddy Mumma. I sincerely hope the current situation shifts soon so that we're all safe and healthy, and the restrictions are lifted so you can experience this art. And I truly hope that this talk has helped you appreciate the work of Mumma and will enhance your experience of it when you do see it. Thank you very much.